One person in the waiting room. All right, well, move that thing. Hey.
Hey, Maureen.
Hey.
All right. How are you doing?
Good. How are you?
Doing well, doing well. Look, I finally got my hair cut.
Oh, okay. Yes, it looks very nice.
Thank you. I felt like about 10 pounds got taken off my head. It was wonderful.
Yeah. I haven't had mine cut since February, so it's ridiculous. I haven't been able to do a ponytail in years, and I can do one now. So
I think I was just about to be able to do one myself.
Well, how did it feel? Was it safe? Did you feel like it was?
I did. You couldn't wait for your haircut in the shop. You had to wait outside, and then they would call you in as soon as your stylist was ready. They were spraying down the chairs in between customers, and you know they were doing it at half capacity, so only every other chair could be occupied. And I mean, all of the stylists were wearing masks. Most of the patrons were wearing masks. So it was, attention was being paid to all the places you can pay attention,
Okay, well, that's good to know. Did you say you go to Chop?
Chop Midtown, yes.
Yeah, because that's where my son goes, and he needs a haircut. So I'm going to tell him what you said. He's been afraid to go.
Yeah, it's. I don't know, man. This is my first global pandemic. I'm not quite sure sort of what to think about all of it. All I'm trying to do is the same kinds of things that I try to do to avoid illness at any time is just not touch stuff and not get too close to people and just more than usual, trying to adhere to those things and not make, unnecessary trips into town and
Right. Just wear a mask when you're around people and stuff. Yeah, that's what I'm doing. Yeah.
But now there are certain relatives that I've just not gone near because if they have any sort of respiratory illness or the kind of thing where they just can't afford to get sick at all.
Yes. Yeah.
So.
I'm trying to take attendance. We have had more people sign up since last week, so.
Really? More people? Shoot.
More people.
I was worried that with the technical trouble that we had last week that we would have fewer people this time around.
Well, some of them might not come back. I just don't know, but I think we're going to have people make up for them. So
that sounds good. And my changes that I've made for this week is I will mute everybody once I get a chance to get in and kind of say and make sure everybody knows that just because you're muted doesn't mean you can't talk. You just got to do it by text.
Yes. Okay. And you can always unmute at the very end if anybody can't do the typing.
Right. And I'm hoping that will help because that means fewer sources of sound.
Right.
The other thing that I've done is I am not on a wireless connection now. I am wired to my router.
Okay.
So hopefully that will make a difference.
Hopefully it will. If not, I mean, it just maybe this is the best we can do. I was in a conference yesterday and some of us gave presentations at a national conference and sometimes people were just a little bit staticky and that's just the way it was, I think, but you can still hear them.
We will always remember this as the time that the entire nation learned how to teleconference.
Right, exactly. No matter what age you are, and
We'll never go back from this because the old excuse used to be, well, my generation didn't come up with that. We really prefer in-person presentations only. That's what we're willing to pay for. That's what we're going to do. Now there's a health mandate to essentially learn this method.
Yeah, so everybody's.
So.
Oops. Okay.
Very good. Well, I tell you what, word must be spreading because I keep getting requests for genealogy Zoom presentations and things like that. I just agreed to do one for Leon County Public Library. I think we're going to do land documents, how to use land documents for genealogy. But anyway, this we've been getting requests in, so I'm glad folks are seeing that we're doing these.
Yeah, I think the word's getting out, and people need things to do.
We've got all the, we can do so much with the images and maps, and we can do almost anything that we could do in person this way. The only thing I can't do is show you the actual physical. I can't do like I do when I take you on a tour in the stacks. I can't let you pick up. All right, there we go. Okay, I'm going to do some housekeeping real quick before we get started. I want to click on our participants tab here and mute everybody. Okay. All right. Now everybody should be muted. Okay. I've made a welcome. Thank you everybody for joining us once again. I understand we have some new people today. Welcome to all of you as well to Florida at the Crossroads of Empire, 1513 to 1821. My name is Josh Goodman. I am the staff historian at the State Archives of Florida right here in Tallahassee. And we have a great program for you today. We had a lot of fun last week, I think. I've made some changes to try and help us not have quite as many of the technical errors that we had last time. I am plugged into the wall this time rather than being on a wireless connection. I hope that that helps us this time around. Also, I have gone ahead and muted everyone. So that means that you won't be able to speak to myself or each other during the presentation, but remember that you still have the opportunity to use textual chat. If you mouse around in your Zoom window there, you'll see down there where it says security and participants and things like that, that you have the word chat down there, and you can use that to chat with other folks. Okay, somebody has shared their screen. All right, let me see if I can, okay, yes, stop that share screen. There we go. All right. Now you are screen sharing. Excellent. Okay, what I'd like is, can everybody see the, all right, participants, there's that. Hang on just a second, just making sure we've got everything all set. Show everything. Okay. Can everybody see the slide deck that says Florida at the Crossroads of Empire? Give me a nod if you can. Awesome. Okay, I'm going to take that to mean that my slide deck is showing just perfectly. I'm going to run to the next slide just to make sure that you are able to see when I change slides. You should see the words quick recap. Is everybody seeing the words quick recap? Yes? Okay. All right, if at any time you start here, if I start getting garbled or if I'm talking about a slide and it's not showing up on your screen, if you will kindly just put that into the chat box over on the that you have there, I will do what I can to get it to fix that. Sometimes I've found that leaving the room, if I leave the room and come back, sometimes it will help that. But anyway, so we'll go ahead and get started with part 2 of our program on Florida at the Crossroads of Empire. Now, I've got a couple of folks in the waiting room, so I'm going to let them in real quick. Okay. All right, there we go. And I've still got everybody on mute. Okay, there we go. All right, so a welcome to all of you who are just joining us. If you are just joining us, you'll note that I have everybody muted, but you're still able to use the textual chat box to get in touch with me. All right, and I see my new folks may not be muted, so I'm going to go ahead and mute you now. Okay, all right. So here we go. Let's go ahead and just do a quick recap of kind of where we got to last week. And just to sort of let you know where we got to. We started off with the Spanish arriving in Florida for the first time in 1513, the well-documented claim to Florida made by Ponce de Leon in 1513. Claiming Florida was one thing, of course. Settling it was another kettle of fish entirely. We noted, for example, let me get my pen going here. Here's Ponce over here on the left. We noted that, that Ponce came over. He sighted Florida on this side for the first time in 1513. And then a few years later in 1521, he tried to create a permanent establishment, a permanent colony on the Gulf Coast of Florida around Charlotte Harbor. And it didn't work out so well for him. And he ended up getting wounded by Indians and eventually died from those wounds. And so that colony didn't really take off the ground. But there were plenty of other Spaniards who wanted to try and colonize Florida. We had Panfilo Narvaez, who came over later in the 16th century. He landed at Tampa Bay here and he made a little bit of headway. He managed to make it up the peninsula and at least as far as St. Mark's. But unfortunately, he ran out of food and could not rendezvous with his supply ships. And so a lot of bad stuff befell that expedition. And eventually it got down to only 4 people who finally made it back to Mexico City several years later. One of them thankfully thought to write everything down, and that's why we know as much as we do about the Narvaez expedition. So that one didn't take off so well. Next thing, in the 1530s, we've got everybody's favorite conquistador, Hernando de Soto here in Florida. He stopped off in Tampa Bay as well. And then he made it up, of course, as far as Tallahassee and spent Christmas of 1539 here in Tallahassee, just outside the town of Anhaica, the Timucuan town of Anhaica, and then proceeded to explore all around the southeastern United States. But in all of that, he never actually established a permanent settlement. Okay, let's see, I've got one more person who wants to enter the room, so we're getting that person in right here. Okay, I'm going to make sure that person is muted. All right, I think they are. Okay, so yeah, Narvaez, Ponce de Leon couldn't get it done. Narvaez couldn't get it done. Hernando de Soto couldn't get it done. The last one is one that we don't so often hear about, and that was the attempt to settle Pensacola. And that was our friend here, Tristan de Luna. He came to Pensacola in the 1550s, tried to establish a colony there. It didn't work out so well, and so what it finally took to get the Spanish to finally get a permanent settlement in Florida was it finally took the French coming in, a geopolitical threat rather than just the interest of having Florida for riches and all that sort of thing. It finally took a geopolitical threat from the outside, the French, and particularly a Protestant French threat to arouse the Spanish to really put down roots in Florida. And so in 1565, our buddy Pedro Menéndez de Avilés arrived to boot the French out of Fort Caroline. And in the process, he, of course, established St. Augustine. And that's where we left last week. When we left off last week, St. Augustine was doing just fine, but then a new threat under a different flag came calling, and that's where we're going to start our story today. So this little inset, this little excerpt that I showed you at the end of the program last week is from the oldest object in the state archives. It's really, it's wonderful to be able to use this piece. And so what I'm going to call this segment of our four-part program here is Part 2, A Crowded Continent, because that is indeed going to be the theme of our program today. After the latter part of the 16th century, North America is going to get very crowded very quickly. Lots of empires jostling around for position and advantage in the southeastern part of North America that's now the southeastern United States. So this is the most of, not all of, but this is most of that map that I was showing you at the end of the program last week. This is a nice, it's St. Augustine as it existed in 1586. The map is actually done in 1589, but it's depicting St. Augustine as it was observed in 1586 by the Italian cartographer Battista Boasio. The State Archives of Florida does own the actual physical original of this map. It was donated to the State Archives in 1981 by the family of a former state treasurer, William Valentine Knott. If any of you've ever been to the Knott House that's on Park Avenue downtown, that's his house. And that's the same Knott family. They found this, I believe they found it behind a photograph or some other image that was in a frame, and they were unframing it, and they found this map, and they determined that it was an authentic original done by Batista Boazio. So what a find, especially when they gave that to the State Archives. So if we zoom in on the different parts of the map, we can see what St. Augustine had managed to accomplish 20 years after being established in the 1560s. So let's do that. Let's zoom in. First, here's kind of the top left-hand side of the map here. And it's a little bit faded out here. The contrast isn't so good, but I can point out a few of the things that are here because Batista Boazio, since he was, oh, let me not give that away. Suffice it to say, there's a key that goes to this map. If you look very carefully, I'm going to use a pointer here. If you look very carefully, there's letters all over the map. And what they're doing is they're showing you all of the different features of St. Augustine that Boazio observed when he arrived in St. Augustine in 1586. So, for example, the L part right here, okay, this is what he referred to as the town of St. Augustine, and you can see that they've got some houses in here. They've got some agricultural fields going on up here where they're growing different crops. We know that they had orange groves, and that they had a number of other commodities there. They also had right here their townhouse or council house where local political decisions, governmental decisions would have been made. And then we've also got over here in a watchtower where they could keep an eye on things that were coming in from the bay over there near Anastasia Island. And then down here with O, this was the church. Because as you can imagine, the Spanish are devoutly Catholic, and so of course the church follows the flag wherever the flag goes in the New World. And so they established a church here and had a pretty substantial religious program for the inhabitants of St. Augustine. This becomes that church right there, although it gets burned down a few times, I hate to say it, but it becomes essentially the forerunner. It is the beginning of the first permanent Catholic congregation in what is now the United States. I think I got that right. I used to say North America, but then I've got people who say, well, Mexico is part of North America, so you can't really say that, and that's true. So anyway, so the oldest Catholic congregation, permanent Catholic congregation in what is now the United States. I think that's the right way to say it. Okay, so let's see. This looks like a pretty peaceful scene, right? We've got all this wonderful domestic building and construction, and St. Augustine's just moving right along. But look a little carefully. Look at what Boazio has put in here with these people. Look what these people are doing. We got people wearing blue. We got people wearing red. We got horses that are running. And, we've got all this, look, we've got guys on horseback. There's very clearly some action going on. It almost looks like these guys are holding guns. So I kind of left a part out. There's something I forgot to mention with this. Is that, oh, and by the way, here's the fort, which is located just a little bit to the north of that village scene that we saw in the upper left portion of the map. And look, on this side here, these cannons appear to be firing here on the front. But what are they firing at? They're firing at these guys. This is actually a fleet of ships being led by the British corsair, Sir Francis Drake. And so what I neglected to tell you about this is that Batista Boazio wasn't just drawing this map for fun. He was actually in the employ of the English government at this time, drawing maps, recording the exploits of Sir Francis Drake. And what you're seeing here is Sir Francis Drake's raid on Spanish St. Augustine in 1586. So who was Sir Francis Drake, and why was he attacking St. Augustine? Let me get this person admitted to the room here. Okay, all right. So who is Sir Francis Drake? Well, he was born in St. Augustine, or excuse me, not born in St. Augustine, heavens. He was born in England around 1540 and was apprenticed at a very young age to his dad's neighbor. His dad was a religious man, was a pastor or rector of some sort over there in the church. And his neighbor was a guy who operated a small vessel doing some trade between England and France. And so Drake's dad apprenticed him at a very young age to this neighbor who has this shipping business, and that's where Drake kind of cut his teeth as a mariner. All right. Now, Drake did such a good job and was such a good seaman that the man he was apprenticed to actually left young Drake the ship that he had trained on in his will. And so Drake actually starts his own mercantile shipping business as a result of that. He also later started making voyages with his second cousin, who was a guy named Sir John Hawkins. Now, these weren't just any voyages that Hawkins and the young Francis Drake were making. These were actually sort of raids, you might say, almost piracy in a sense, almost like a legal form of piracy or privateering, because what they would do is Drake and his cousin Hawkins, they would go down to the west coast of Africa, and they would actually attack shipping and small towns on the coast of Africa that were held by the Portuguese, because the English and Portuguese were in some conflicts at that time, and the English government issued to its merchant fleet, to its merchant marine, what was called letters of marque. That's M-A-R-Q-U-E, letters of marque. And what these were essentially royal licenses for a merchant vessel to arm itself and go after other merchant vessels flying the flag of a sworn enemy. Because, and the reason that a country would do this is because, navies are very expensive. Of course, we have one nowadays and we hold it at taxpayer expense. But in those days, it was just, it was a tremendous expense. And rather than have the government have all of these naval ships just kind of sitting around in between wars, instead they would oftentimes co-opt the assistance of these merchant vessels that were doing trade all over the place. And so Drake and Hawkins came by some of these letters of marque, and so they used that as pretext to attack some of this Portuguese shipping on the west coast of Africa. Now, after they had some time doing that, and they'd spent some time gathering up cargoes of slaves on the western coast of Africa, they then decided to start taking their business model over to the New World. And so they actually spent some time, Drake and Hawkins spent some time selling slaves to the Spanish over in the New World, who then were able to use it on some of their plantations in the Caribbean. So in 1572 is when Drake and Hawkins started making these expeditions. But the Spanish were not always so nice to English vessels either. Just like the English and Portuguese had their family troubles, so did the Spanish and English as well. And so as a result of that, Drake started acquiring letters of marque to go after the Spanish as well. In 1572, he attacked the Isthmus of Panama down here, right here. And the reason why this was such an important target was because Spain had silver mines down here in Peru. It's just a little bit off the map. You can't quite see it here. But Spain had silver mines down there. And they were also getting gold from Central America and other things. But if those things were acquired on the Pacific coast, at that time, it was far too long of a voyage for them to carry it across the Pacific and get back to England that way. Also, the Panama Canal doesn't exist at this time. So they had to actually bring any cargo that was shipped originally in the Pacific Ocean, they had to bring it to the Isthmus of Panama and truck it across the isthmus on foot. Well, mules and that sort of thing. And so that was kind of a choke point. And Drake recognized that, so he actually attacked shipping there at the Isthmus of Panama. And then the following year, in 1573, he actually teamed up with a group of French privateers. Imagine that, British and French guys working together. After what we saw last week, you might find it difficult to believe that that could be done. But suffice it to say, when guys were able to find a bit of common interest, there's no telling what all they could do. So anyway, he gets together with this group in 1573 with these French privateers, and they start attacking various spots over here, a silver train over here. And gosh, what's the name of that town where they did that? I think it's Portobello. I wouldn't swear to it. Don't quote me on that. But it's right in here in this part of the Caribbean. I forget exactly which one of these it is. And the word is that it wasn't a perfect escape. The Spanish, were pretty heavily fortified in this area. They had garrisons, small groups of soldiers who were supposed to be protecting these mines and the trade routes to get everything back to the Caribbean so they could get it back on the Spanish main. And so when Drake and his buddies were trying to carry all this treasure back to their ships, the Spanish were starting to overrun them. And so they decided, rather than, risk their lives getting all this stuff into their boats, because it would have taken a while, they actually buried some of that treasure in hidden places along the beach. And there's some historians who believe that it was cases like this where pirates had so much stuff that they had to bury it rather than take it all, that's where we kind of get this idea of pirates and buried treasure. Because if you think about it, why wouldn't a pirate want to carry all their treasure with them? Well, sometimes they just had so much of it they couldn't get it all at one time. Maybe they were under attack or something like that. And so that's part of where we get this legend of pirates and hidden treasure and that sort of thing. So in England, with all of this, Drake is a hero, because he's really taken it to the Spanish, and he had already had his exploits over in Western Africa. The guy was a hero. But as far as the Spanish was concerned, he was a pirate, and so that develops an animosity between Drake and the Spanish that is going to play out later on, and we're going to see that even in Florida. However, his sovereign, Elizabeth I, was pretty happy with Drake. She actually knighted him after he got finished being the first Englishman to circumnavigate the globe. He did that. It took him a couple of years. He started in 1578 just on a regular old trip over to the Americas, and then decided to go ahead and try and make that trip around the world. And he was the first guy to be the head captain throughout the entire thing. If you remember, Magellan, his expedition, Ferdinand Magellan, he's the first guy to actually circumnavigate the globe, but he's not alive for the whole journey. He's also not the captain for the whole journey. So Drake is kind of the first guy to do the whole thing, and certainly the first English guy to do it. So if you couldn't tell already, let's see, we got somebody trying to get in. So let me admit them. All right, welcome to Isabel. All right, so if you couldn't tell already, England and Spain were kind of on the outs at this time, and things got worse in the 1580s. The reason why things got worse in the 1580s specifically it's actually a European conflict, not so much something that was happening here in the New World. But Spain was trying to retain control of the Netherlands, right around Amsterdam and all of that over in Europe, and because just a whole variety of dynastic issues. And Spain had control of the Netherlands at that time, and that made England very, very nervous, because the Netherlands are right across the English Channel from England, and that presented a geopolitical challenge that Elizabeth I and her ministers just really could not abide by. And so they started, that started a series of conflicts between the English and the Spanish in Europe. But as an added bonus, Elizabeth I sent Sir Francis Drake over to the New World to harass shipping along the Spanish Main. And so he made a couple of different trips. For example, when he came over in the 1580s, he sacked Santo Domingo right here. In what's now the Dominican Republic. This over here is Haiti, and then you've got the Dominican Republic. So Drake paid a visit to Santo Domingo, sacked that, and then came down here to Cartagena in what's modern-day Colombia. Sorry, I've completely ruined the whole map with red ink here. I can probably get rid of all that, can't I? Yeah, there we go. So he stops over here on Santo Domingo. Then he comes down here to Cartagena, and he actually does a ransoming technique where he grabs all their supplies and stuff, and he holds the city ransom. Unless they paid him, he wouldn't turn back over all the stuff he took from them. So pretty nasty stuff, the kind of thing you would see in a movie. He had wanted to come up here and get the real prize, which was Havana. Havana is kind of like the nerve center of the Spanish Caribbean in the 16th and 17th centuries. But unfortunately, attacking these other two ports along the way, that didn't, Drake ended up losing a lot of men that way, and he also had some problems with disease on board his ships. And he didn't feel like he was going to be able to attack the Spanish nerve center at this time. And so as a result of that, he decided to pass Havana up. However, as he was meandering his way through the remainder of the Spanish Main, harassing shipping in that area, he did decide to go to St. Augustine, this tiny, compared to Havana, tiny little port, just in the middle of nowhere with no known silver mines or gold mines or anything. But he knew that this was a crucial defense point for the Spanish trade route between the New World and Spain back over in Europe. And so he did pay a visit to St. Augustine in 1586 and burned it to the ground. Okay, and that is what Batista Boazio was depicting in that beautiful map, that 1589 map of St. Augustine, was that attack. Now, the guy who settled St. Augustine, who established it, Pedro Menéndez de Avilés, he was no longer the governor of Spanish Florida at that time. That job had actually passed to his nephew, a dude named Pedro Menéndez Marquez, and he was in charge. And he had some advance attack some advance word that this attack might come, and so he had built a fort. That's the one that we saw back in here if we go back a couple of slides. That was what prompted the construction of this fort. The problem is you can probably see it. If you look very carefully at the map, you can actually see that this fort is constructed not of stone, but of wood. These are actually upright logs that had been put into place. And of course, that construction is used in a variety of forts, not just Spanish forts, but all over the place. That we would continue to see forts constructed that way as late as the mid to late 19th century, 1800s. So the problem with that is that it's very susceptible to fire and therefore destruction. And that's exactly what happened during Drake's raid of 1586. The whole thing was burnt to the ground. Now, thankfully for the Spanish, when Pedro Menéndez de Avilés was still governor, back when St. Augustine was first established, St. Augustine was not the only place that Avilés established, or Menéndez Avilés established. So he had St. Augustine, but he also had that fort up by the mouth of the St. Johns River that we talked about last week, the Fort San Mateo, which had been Fort Caroline when the French had a hold of it. You got to be ready for some name changes when you study this time period, because everything on the map is in a state of flux. Every single country's got a different name for all the different forts and all the different rivers. It is a hoot and a holler to study, but you've got to be ready for some name changes. So, because Fort San Mateo and the blockhouse at Fort Matanzas and a couple other places were in place, even though St. Augustine was burned to the ground by Sir Francis Drake, there still were other places that the Spanish had supplies stored, and so they were able to resupply St. Augustine. But Sir Francis Drake his raid was the beginning of something much bigger, something that will permeate all of our story today, and that is that Spain is no longer alone in North America, and it wasn't just France that wanted to get a foothold. From this point forward, England is going to be one of the biggest threats, if not the biggest threat, to Spanish Florida. So, how that materializes. Okay, question, why was Cuba the nerve center in the late 1500s? That was the most established and best fortified port at that time. It had shipping access to all of the different places in the Spanish Caribbean, good access to the northern tier of South America. Now, of course, the other big center at this time is Veracruz, which is over on the coast of Mexico. The Viceroyalty of New Spain or Mexico was headquartered there. But for most of your Caribbean operations, Havana is right there geographically in the center. And that's how you get, as a matter of fact, Florida actually took its orders at different times from Havana. Florida itself did not have the same level of autonomy as Havana did. They were actually sort of a sub-province at different times. So there's That changes later on down the line, but that's how it goes in the 16th century. Let's see. All right. Okay, so let's see. All right, so talking about the English. So yeah, we got the English trying to get their way into North America. Now, of course, Drake's raid is in what, 1586. So it's not too long after that that the English start making incursions in other parts of North America, permanent ones. So for example, in 1585 and 1587, two separate English attempts occur to establish a colony at Roanoke at the bottom end of Virginia. Actually, some of those attempts are going to take them into the territory of what we would now call North Carolina. But the attempt is to found a colony at Roanoke. Neither of those actually stick. But in 1607, Jamestown is established in Virginia, and you can see that right here. Mouth of Chesapeake right there. And so 1607 gets established. The Spanish know about all of this. Okay, even though this is an era without radio and internet and television or any modern communications, the Spanish still know that this stuff is going on. All the ambassadors at all the courts of these various countries over in Europe, they talk about this stuff. They brag about this stuff. There's a lot of loose lips. The system is not particularly built for secrecy. And so not only that, you've also got ships under all flags that are out here in the Atlantic exploring. Some of them are fishing. Some of them are making their own little private attempts to go and make some sort of profit off of the unclaimed land in North America. So the Spanish know that the English are here in the 1580s and 1607. But there's not a whole lot they can do about it. Spain is stretched pretty thin because remember they got stuff going on here in Mexico. They got stuff going on in South America. They got stuff going on practically every Caribbean island big enough to have people living on it. And so they're stretched a little bit thin. So they do send some reconnaissance missions in 1609 and 1611 to go and monitor what's happening at Jamestown. But as you know, from studying early American history, Jamestown struggles a little bit right there in the beginning, and so do many of the other colonies. And the Spanish had some experience with struggling colonies, and the way they saw it, usually takes people a while before they figure out how to make a settlement stick in North America. So they just kind of hoped against hope that these little fledgling English settlements would not come to much. The problem was that the English did get well established. Jamestown did survive. Other colonies began appearing, okay? Massachusetts Bay Colony, they started expanding outward. You get expansion into, Maryland gets started. You've got other colonies that start coming online, and they're not going anywhere. Winter comes and goes, and they're not running out of supplies. And this becomes increasingly concerning for the Spanish. And to make matters worse, those Englishmen who were making their livelihoods right here in the area of Virginia, they start exploring southward to see what kinds of things might be there. They know that the Spanish have claimed La Florida, and they realize that the boundaries of La Florida at that time did not stop at the St. Mary's River like they do nowadays. In those days, the Spanish actually claimed well up even into where Jamestown was located. This was what they like to call the debatable lands. This area where the Georgia and the Carolinas and Tennessee and all of that is. And as we're going to see in other maps in the presentation today, nobody really has a firm line of exactly what's Spanish and what's English. What matters to actually determine where the line is who has the men and the resources to actually hold territory. So let's look at a little bit of how that happens. Okay, let's see. So before we get on with that, the English, in addition to pushing southward from the new colony of Virginia, like I've shown you here on the map, the English pirates don't stop either. The English privateers. Best example of English privateers harassing Spanish Florida even after Jamestown is established is the 1668 raid of a guy named Robert Searles, also known as John Davis. He's more commonly known as John Davis, I think. He raids St. Augustine in 1668, right down here, and he attacks by sea, of course. And after he sacked the town, essentially burned it to the ground, much as it had been when Sir Francis Drake came along, about 80 years before that. That prompted the Spanish officials at that time to build a landmark that many of you, no doubt, have either seen in photographs or perhaps even seen in person, which is the Castillo de San Marcos. So the plan was to start building the event that essentially prompted this beautiful fort to be constructed happened in 1668 with that raid from Robert Searles. Another fun fact about Robert Searles, aka John Davis, is that he was once a lieutenant of another British privateer called Sir Henry Morgan, which some of you may know as the guy on the front of every bottle of Captain Morgan's spiced rum. So there's a little fun fact for you right there. Now this was bound to lead to trouble, okay? Because, Spanish Florida was way more than just St. Augustine, as I say. Now this map that I'm showing you right here, so we've got Jamestown up this way. We've got what would eventually become the Carolinas and Georgia later on down the line. We don't have those guys founded just yet, but suffice it to say, we have kind of the English presence up this way. All right, they're definitely holding this area, but they're pushing down even farther. The Spanish, they're headquartered right here at St. Augustine, but they are pushing up this way. And part of the reason they're doing that is because ever since the Spanish established themselves in the 16th century, part of their plan for expansion was to establish missions, Catholic missions, run by the Franciscans, the order of, I think it's the order of Francis of Assisi. I think it's Francis of Assisi. It may just be St. Francis. Don't quote me on that. But I think it's Sir Francis of Assisi. And they called themselves the Franciscans. And so they established missions not just along the old Spanish trail like we know about, the ones right here in what is now Florida even today, but they also expanded up into Georgia and even into the Carolinas to get missions up that way as well. So you get this whole line of missions that's extending westward and northward from St. Augustine. And they're connected by roads, that some of which are still kind of in use today. If you see the old St. Augustine Road here in Tallahassee, that's actually part of what was once called the Camino Real, which is the Royal Road leading from St. Augustine westward as far as those Spanish possessions went. And at times there were pieces of it that went all the way over to Louisiana. You can actually see the old Spanish Trail when you're on I-10 and you're headed south into New Orleans. You can see a road that's referred to as the old Spanish Trail. It's essentially the same trail. It gets broken up in a few places, but you see. All right, so we've got all of the Spanish presence because of the missions, and those missions have dual purposes. Yes, they are about converting the local Native Americans, because as we talked about last week, part of the way of kind of making a way of living, a modus vivendi between the Native Americans and the Spanish, was for the Spanish to actually convert those Native Americans and convince them that it was to their spiritual interest to cooperate with the Spanish. And so that was one part of what the missions were meant to do. It also was quite political, because there would be times, the Spanish knew, when their claims to Florida would be contested, especially as they got farther and farther away from the epicenter of their toehold on the Atlantic coast at St. Augustine. And for that reason, having the Indians on their side would be a big advantage. Not so much that they 100% trusted the Native Americans, because as we've seen, the natives are not exactly totally friendly to the Spanish when they come in. But it would be better for the Indians to be at least familiar with and oriented towards the Spanish rather than in the hands of their enemies, okay? And so that's sort of the dual purpose of these missions as we go. But the English are expanding as well, southward, okay, as we've talked about. And then that expansion becomes codified, essentially, starting in the 1620s when Sir Robert Heath, who was the Attorney General of King Charles I, he's in the House of Stuart that took over after the last Tudor died, after Queen Elizabeth died in 1603. And so this dude, Sir Robert Heath, he obtained a charter for a new colony in North America to be located to the south of Virginia called Carolina. Now, it was not North Carolina and South Carolina yet. That took a while, and it took a few political differences between the Northern and Southern Carolinians before that split occurred. But at the time, it was just one Carolina. And so Sir Robert Heath gets that charter. But before you get that committed to memory too much, go ahead and kind of don't assign it too much space in your memory blank, because that particular charter does not actually hold out. However, in 1663, later on down the line, when the next Charles is in office, Charles II, a new charter was issued to a group of 8 Englishmen, 8 English noblemen rather, who were called the Lords Proprietors of Carolina. And they were granted a charter very similar to Sir Robert Heath's. The idea was that the colony would be called Carolina, just like Heath's was going to be. But they were getting this charter because Charles II, he was the first Stuart to kind of take back over after Oliver Cromwell had kind of caused a little bit of trouble there in the 17th century. If you're familiar with the revolution there, when Oliver Cromwell led this group to sort of cut the head off of Charles I. Anyway, Charles II is the Restoration King who gets back on the throne after the Cromwells are gone. And in return for all these guys helping Charles II get back on the throne, he gave out all kinds of favors to those families. And this was the favor that was given to those 8 Lords Proprietors. They were given the charter to have this new colony in North America called Carolina. Now, they decided to make a statement with this charter because the northern boundary of the Carolina colony was supposed to be 36 degrees, 30 minutes north, which kind of puts it real close to the boundary of Virginia. In fact, there was actually some disputed territory right here that didn't quite get resolved until after the American Revolution. It's just this little 60, I forget if it's 60 square miles or whatever it is. Anyway, there's a little strip of land up here that was actually in dispute because of this charter up there for quite some time. That's the northern boundary of Carolina. Guess where they put the southern boundary? Let me get a new color here because I have really done a number on the map here. The southern boundary of the new Carolina colony was set to be at 29 degrees north, which is located about right here, just south of Daytona Beach. So essentially, what the people who founded Carolina were saying is that they were claiming all of the territory between Virginia and Cape Canaveral, which includes essentially all of the territory that was formerly held by the Spanish in Spanish Florida. Ooh, this is going to cause some problems. Okay, so they backed up this claim with some settlements because in 1670 they established Charlestown, or modern-day Charleston. Beautiful little harbor, and it's a nice little place. Charleston's right down here, close to where Arista was located. And it's a good thing that the Carolina settlers did that, because about the same year, Spain and England signed a treaty. Oh, breaking up. Okay. Am I breaking up for anybody else? Are you having any trouble breaking up? Sound okay? Sound not okay? Uh-oh. Okay, so sound not okay. All right. I'm going to try something real quick. I'm going to stop my screen share. And I'm going to leave the room really quick and come right back and see if that helps. Okay, so bear with me for just a moment. We're going to take about a 2-minute break while I do that, and I'll be right back in the room, okay?